The most dangerous wars do not always announce themselves with columns of tanks crossing a border or missiles streaking across a skyline. Sometimes they begin with something smaller, uglier, and easier to dismiss. A train burns in Latvia. Railway control equipment is set on fire. The attackers film the damage and send the footage back to whoever commissioned it. Then that same footage is pushed into the information space and repackaged to suggest the sabotage happened somewhere else, in some other war, for some other purpose. That is what Latvia's State Security Service says happened in a case it has now made public. 2 people allegedly carried out sabotage for Russian interests, targeting rail infrastructure and helping feed a false narrative after the attack. On the surface, it looks like a local crime. In reality, it may be something far more chilling. It may be a glimpse of how a modern power tries to wound an entire continent without ever formally declaring war on it. That is why this story matters, because the real headline is not one burned train in one Baltic country. The real headline is that Western officials now describe a pattern, not a coincidence. The Associated Press has tracked at least 151 sabotage and other malicious incidents across Europe since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that officials in the West have linked to Moscow or to operations carried out in Russia's interests. Fires, cyber attacks, warehouse attacks, infrastructure disruption, courier networks, proxy actors, intimidation campaigns. Taken separately, they can look random. Taken together, they begin to look like a method. And the method is brutally efficient. It is cheaper than open war, harder to attribute, easier to deny, and perfectly designed to exploit the single greatest weakness of democratic societies: the instinct to wait for absolute proof before reacting to a pattern that is already damaging them. The official story in Europe is still framed in careful, legal, almost sterile language. Europe is supporting Ukraine. Europe is protecting its infrastructure. Europe is responding to destabilizing acts. Europe is avoiding escalation. But the darker possibility is that escalation has already happened. It just happened below the threshold where politicians are comfortable using the word war. Because what do you call a sustained campaign that seeks to damage railways, frighten populations, drain intelligence services, pressure governments, and manipulate public understanding of events? If it is not peace, and it is not acknowledged as war, then it lives in that gray zone where the aggressor gains all the benefits of pressure, while the target remains trapped in procedural caution. That is the strategic beauty of a shadow war. It lets one side act with purpose, while the other side debates terminology. And there is another layer here that makes this even more disturbing. Officials and investigators say many of these operations use proxies. In some cases, the people doing the work may not even fully understand who is behind it. That matters because it changes the architecture of threat. This is no longer just about professional intelligence officers in trench coats or elite cyber units breaking into networks from afar. This is about a system that can recruit disposable hands, blend criminality with geopolitics, and fuse digital manipulation with physical damage. One former British cyber official told AP that Europe is increasingly seeing cyberkinetic behavior, operations where digital action produces real-world disruption. That phrase should terrify policymakers more than it currently seems to. Because once cyber and physical sabotage blend together, the battlefield is no longer out there. It is the transport node, the warehouse, the relay cabinet, the data line, the port schedule, the insurance market, the election feed, the rumor chain, the thing everyone thought was too mundane to become a front line. Look again at the Latvia case, because it is almost a perfect microcosm of the wider model. The alleged attackers did not just damage rail infrastructure. According to Latvia's security service, they also recorded the attack, and the material was then used to falsely claim the sabotage had taken place in Ukraine. That means the operation was designed to do more than destroy equipment. It was designed to destroy clarity. First comes the act. Then comes the manipulated narrative. One hit lands on physical systems. Another lands on public perception. And that is precisely why these attacks are more dangerous than old-fashioned sabotage. Traditional sabotage damages something tangible. This newer form damages the thing democratic societies need most in a crisis: confidence in what is actually happening. If people no longer trust the evidence in front of them, every future incident becomes easier to exploit, distort, and weaponize. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Europe says it is trying to prevent a wider war with Russia, but a campaign like this is powerful precisely because it creates the effects of a wider war without triggering the formal response that a wider war would bring. No mobilization, no dramatic red lines, no single event so overwhelming that it forces unity overnight. Just pressure, 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 applied across infrastructure, politics, media, and psychology. Western officials quoted by AP have said these incidents appear intended to undermine support for Ukraine, spread fear, and exhaust the resources of European security services. In other words, the objective may not be to conquer territory. It may be to corrode endurance. And for Moscow, that could be enough. Because if Europe becomes distracted, divided, tired, or afraid, then Russia does not need a battlefield breakthrough to gain strategic ground. It only needs Europe to become less willing, less focused, and less coherent over time. That should change how we think about success and failure in this conflict. For years, the public conversation has often centered on maps in Ukraine. Whose artillery has range? Whose brigades are exhausted? Whose supply lines are thinner? Whose cities are within missile reach? Those things are real, and they matter. But there is another question now, maybe the more important one. Can Europe remain politically, psychologically, and institutionally stable under a campaign designed not to defeat it in battle, but to wear it down from inside its own peacetime routines? Because democracies are not only defended by armies, they are defended by public trust, administrative competence, credible media, resilient infrastructure, and a shared sense that the system still works. A shadow war attacks those foundations one layer at a time. It is a war against attention spans, against social cohesion, against the patience of voters and the bandwidth of investigators. And if that is the real contest underway, then the map of the war has already grown far beyond Ukraine. If you want analysis that connects sabotage, elections, and the wider power game before the headlines fully catch up, subscribe now. Because this story is not moving in a straight line. It is spreading sideways. And one of the clearest signs of that sideways spread may be Hungary, where another kind of battle is now playing out. Not over rail relays and burned equipment, but over narrative, legitimacy, and who gets to define the national threat. Hungary's government says it will declassify a national security report that Prime Minister Viktor Orbán claims will show Ukraine illegally funded his main political rival, Peter Magyar. AP reported those claims were made without public evidence, while Magyar denied them and warned separately of possible Russian interference in Hungary's election. Orbán, facing a difficult contest ahead of the April 12th vote, has intensified anti-Ukraine rhetoric, and AP reported his campaign has used disinformation and AI-generated imagery aimed at President Volodymyr Zelensky. Whether one believes Orbán, Magyar, both, or neither, the key point is this. Hungary's political arena is now saturated with foreign threat narratives at the exact moment when Europe most needs clarity and cohesion. And that is why Hungary matters far beyond Hungary. Because a shadow war does not only damage things, it rearranges what people fear. If rail sabotage teaches citizens that infrastructure is vulnerable, election warfare teaches them that truth itself is vulnerable. One story tells them the state cannot fully protect systems. The other tells them the state cannot fully protect meaning. In Hungary, the government has tied the coming election to national survival, accusing Ukraine and foreign-linked actors of seeking to manipulate the outcome, while the opposition leader has warned that Russian interference is the danger. That does not produce a healthy democratic argument. It produces a hall of mirrors. And a hall of mirrors is a dream environment for any outside power that benefits when Europeans stop trusting one another long before they stop trusting Moscow. Because once politics becomes a permanent emergency theater, every accusation deepens paralysis. Every piece of evidence is contested, and every institutional move risks being seen as part of somebody else's operation. The timing makes the picture even darker. AP reports that tensions between Budapest and Kiev have escalated sharply in recent days, with Hungary's government hardening its anti-Ukraine posture, seizing cash and gold from Ukrainian bank couriers in one separate dispute, and tying its domestic political messaging to sovereignty, energy security, and the danger of being pulled into direct conflict with Russia. AP also reported that Hungary's government has opposed additional support for Ukraine and vetoed further sanctions measures. Again, the point is not that every event sits inside one centrally scripted plot. The point is that all of these disputes accumulate inside the same strategic weather system. The more Europe argues internally over Ukraine, sanctions, energy, elections, and foreign manipulation, the easier it becomes for any hostile actor to amplify division without needing to create it from nothing. That is how influence works in a stressed system. It does not always invent the crack. It widens the crack that is already there. Now step back from the individual cases and look at how institutions are responding. NATO did not launch Baltic Sentry because everything was normal. The alliance announced that operation to strengthen protection of critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea and improve the ability of member states to respond to destabilizing acts. The mission includes a larger military presence, with assets such as frigates and maritime patrol aircraft, and it was presented as a direct response to the growing threat facing undersea and regional infrastructure. That is not the language of a continent enjoying strategic calm. That is the language of a continent adapting to sustained vulnerability. And adaptation is costly. Every ship on sentry duty, every intelligence team reassigned to sabotage cases, every cyber unit pulled into infrastructure protection, every law enforcement man-hour redirected toward proxy networks. That is capacity not being used somewhere else. This is part of what makes shadow warfare so effective. It does not merely break targets. It taxes the defender continuously. For ordinary people, this may still sound abstract. Sabotage, proxy actors, influence campaigns, counterintelligence, gray zone pressure. It can all feel like the language of closed-door briefings, not everyday life. But the consequences are not abstract at all. When rail systems are attacked, logistics become more fragile. When undersea infrastructure becomes a worry, governments must spend more on protection, surveillance, and redundancy. When election narratives are flooded with claims of foreign interference, trust erodes not only in politicians, but in the basic fairness of the democratic process. Insurance costs rise, security budgets swell, public attention fragments. Voters become more cynical and more combustible at the same time. And all of that lands in societies that are already carrying inflation scars, energy anxieties, migration pressures, and the political fatigue of multiple overlapping crises. A shadow war thrives in exactly that environment because it does not need to create panic from scratch. It only needs to turn existing stress into strategic leverage. So where does this go next? One path is the disciplined one. Europe treats these incidents not as scattered irritants, but as parts of a connected campaign. That means protecting infrastructure as if it were a military asset, not a background assumption. It means tightening counterintelligence cooperation, hardening transport and energy nodes, mapping the financial and criminal channels used to recruit proxies, and developing a public communication strategy that reacts faster than disinformation networks do. It also means admitting something politically uncomfortable. A continent can be under attack even when no treaty article has been formally triggered and no capital has been bombed. NATO's response in the Baltic suggests at least some leaders understand that. The question is whether that understanding can spread from the security bureaucracy into the political mainstream before the next wave of incidents arrives. The other path is slower, softer, and in the long run potentially more dangerous. Europe continues to treat each event as basically separate. A fire here, a rumor there, an election scandal somewhere else, a cyber breach, a few arrests, another denial from Moscow, another cautious statement from officials, another promise to investigate, another debate over whether attribution is sufficient, another news cycle that moves on before a pattern settles in the public mind. That path does not end in a cinematic collapse. It ends in something more realistic and maybe more damaging. Gradual acclimatization. Citizens learn to live with uncertainty. Governments normalize chronic vulnerability. Institutions become reactive rather than strategic. And by the time the public fully understands that the continent has been operating under systematic pressure, the aggressor has already banked years of asymmetric advantage without ever needing a spectacular escalation. That is the quiet genius of gray zone conflict. It wins by teaching the target to call abnormal conditions normal. What makes this moment so consequential is not simply that there are more incidents. It is that the logic behind them is becoming easier to see. Damage the infrastructure, manipulate the narrative, deepen domestic polarization, raise the cost of solidarity with Ukraine, force NATO and EU states to spend more time defending the rear, encourage every country to wonder whether its weakest institutions are now entry points for outside pressure. And above all, keep the entire campaign in that deniable zone, where the victim is always one step behind, always debating, always explaining, never fully transforming its posture. That is why the Latvia case matters. That is why the Hungary story matters. That is why Baltic Century matters. They are not random headlines sitting next to one another. They are flashes of a larger strategic picture, one in which Russia may be testing whether Europe can be made to fracture without a frontal blow. And that brings us to the hardest conclusion of all. Europe may still think it is helping Ukraine avoid defeat. But the deeper challenge now may be whether Europe can avoid being slowly reconditioned by a conflict that has already spilled beyond Ukraine's trenches into Europe's rail lines, information space, and political bloodstream. This is what shadow war looks like in the 21st century. Not a single thunderclap, but a series of pressures designed to make open societies doubt their own senses, fear their own weaknesses, and eventually bargain with instability because confronting it feels too costly. The question now is no longer whether Europe can identify the next incident after it happens. The question is whether Europe can recognize the war behind the incidents before that war rewrites the continent's politics from the inside. If a burned train can become propaganda, if an election can become a battle space, and if infrastructure defense now demands military posture, then the line between frontline and home front may already be collapsing. Subscribe, because this is not just about what happened in Latvia or what happens in Hungary next month. It is about whether Europe is waking up to the kind of war it is already living through. And before we end, ask yourself 3 things. If democracies are being attacked through ambiguity, are they still organized for clarity? If public trust becomes the real target, which country is most exposed? And if this is only the opening phase of Europe's shadow war, what happens when the next strike is bigger, closer, and impossible to explain away?